The Mysterious Island, by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 9. The weather changed during the first week of March. There had been a full moon at the commencement of the month, and the heat was excessive. The atmosphere was felt to be full of electricity, and a period of some length of tempestuous weather was to be feared. Indeed, on the 2nd, peals of thunder were heard, the wind blew from the east, and hail rattled against the façade of Granite House like volleys of grape-shot. The door and windows were immediately closed, or everything in the rooms would have been drenched. On seeing these hailstones, some of which were the size of a pigeon's egg, Pencroft's first thought was that his cornfield was in serious danger. He directly rushed to his field, where little green heads were already appearing, and by means of a great cloth he managed to protect his crop. This bad weather lasted a week, during which time the thunder rolled without cessation in the depths of the sky. The colonists, not having any pressing work out of doors, profited by the bad weather to work at the interior of Granite House, the arrangement of which was becoming more complete from day to day. The engineer made a turning lathe, with which he turned several articles both for the toilet and the kitchen, particularly buttons, the want of which was greatly felt. A gun rack had been made for the firearms, which were kept with extreme care, and neither tables nor cupboards were left incomplete. They sawed, they planed, they filed, they turned, and during the whole of this bad season nothing was heard but the grinding of tools or the humming of the turning lathe which responded to the growling of the thunder. Master Jup had not been forgotten, and he occupied a room at the back, near the storeroom, a sort of cabin with a cot always full of good litter, which perfectly suited his taste. "With good old Jup there's never any quarreling," often repeated Pencroft. "Never any improper reply. What a servant, Neb! What a servant!" Of course, Jup was now well used to service. He brushed their clothes, he turned the spit, he waited at table, he swept the rooms, he gathered wood, and he performed another admirable piece of service which delighted Pencroft. He never went to sleep without first coming to tuck up the worthy sailor in his bed. As to the health of the members of the colony, bipeds or bimana, quadrumana or quadrupeds, it left nothing to be desired. With their life in the open air, on this salubrious soil, under that temperate zone, working both with head and hands, they could not suppose that illness would ever attack them. All were indeed wonderfully well. Herbert had already grown 2 inches in the year. His figure was forming and becoming more manly, and he promised to be an accomplished man, physically as well as morally. Besides, he improved himself during the leisure hours which manual occupations left to him. He read the books found in the case, and after the practical lessons which were taught by the very necessity of their position, he found in the engineer for science and the reporter for languages masters who were delighted to complete his education. The tempest ended about the 9th of March, but the sky remained covered with clouds during the whole of this last summer month. The atmosphere, violently agitated by the electric commotions, could not recover its former purity, and there was almost invariably rain and fog, except for 3 or 4 fine days on which several excursions were made. About this time the female onager gave birth to a young one which belonged to the same sex as its mother, and which throve capitally. In the corral, the flock of musmons had also increased, and several lambs already bleated in the sheds, to the great delight of Neb and Herbert, who had each their favorite among these newcomers. An attempt was also made for the domestication of the peccaries, which succeeded well. A sty was constructed under the poultry yard, and soon contained several young ones in the way to become civilized, that is to say, to become fat under Neb's care. Master Jup, entrusted with carrying them their daily nourishment, leavings from the kitchen, etc., acquitted himself conscientiously of his task. He sometimes amused himself at the expense of his little pensioners by tweaking their tails, but this was mischief and not wickedness, for these little twisted tails amused him like a plaything, and his instinct was that of a child. One day in this month of March, Pencroft, talking to the engineer, reminded Cyrus Harding of a promise which the latter had not as yet had time to fulfill. "You once spoke of an apparatus which would take the place of the long ladders at Granite House, Captain," said he. "Won't you make it some day?" "Nothing will be easier. But is this a really useful thing?" "Certainly, Captain. After we have given ourselves necessaries, let us think a little of luxury. For us it may be luxury, if you like, but for things it is necessary. It isn't very convenient to climb up a long ladder when one is heavily loaded." "Well, Pencroft, we will try to please you," replied Cyrus Harding. "But you have no machine at your disposal." "We will make one." "A steam machine?" "No, a water machine." And indeed, to work his apparatus there was already a natural force at the disposal of the engineer, which could be used without great difficulty. For this it was enough to augment the flow of the little stream which supplied the interior of Granite House with water. The opening among the stones and grass was then increased, thus producing a strong fall at the bottom of the passage, the overflow from which escaped by the inner well. Below this fall the engineer fixed a cylinder with paddles, which was joined on the exterior with a strong cable rolled on a wheel supporting a basket. In this way, by means of a long rope reaching to the ground, which enabled them to regulate the motive power, they could rise in the basket to the door of Granite House. It was on the 17th of March that the lift acted for the first time and gave universal satisfaction. Henceforward all the loads, wood, coal, provisions, and even the settlers themselves, were hoisted by this simple system, which replaced the primitive ladder, and, as may be supposed, no one thought of regretting the change. Top particularly was enchanted with this improvement, for he had not and never could have possessed Master Jup's skill in climbing ladders, and often it was on Neb's back, or even on that of the orang, that he had been obliged to make the ascent to Granite House. About this time, too, Cyrus Harding attempted to manufacture glass, and he at first put the old pottery kiln to this new use. There were some difficulties to be encountered, but, after several fruitless attempts, he succeeded in getting up a glass manufactory, which Gideon Spilett and Herbert, his usual assistants, did not leave for several days. As to the substances used in the composition of glass, they are simply sand, chalk, and soda, either carbonate or sulphate. Now the beach supplied sand, lime supplied chalk, seaweeds supplied soda, pyrites supplied sulphuric acid, and the ground supplied coal to heat the kiln to the wished-for temperature. Cyrus Harding thus soon had everything ready for setting to work. The tool, the manufacture of which presented the most difficulty, was the pipe of the glass-maker, an iron tube 5 or 6 feet long, which collects on one end the material in a state of fusion. But by means of a long, thin piece of iron rolled up like the barrel of a gun, Pencroft succeeded in making a tube soon ready for use. On the 28th of March the tube was heated. 100 parts of sand, 35 of chalk, 40 of sulphate of soda, mixed with 2 or 3 parts of powdered coal, composed the substance, which was placed in crucibles. When the high temperature of the oven had reduced it to a liquid, or rather a pasty state, Cyrus Harding collected with the tube a quantity of the paste. He turned it about on a metal plate, previously arranged, so as to give it a form suitable for blowing. Then he passed the tube to Herbert, telling him to blow at the other extremity. And Herbert, swelling out his cheeks, blew so much and so well into the tube, taking care to twirl it round at the same time, that his breath dilated the glassy mass. Other quantities of the substance in a state of fusion were added to the first, and in a short time the result was a bubble which measured a foot in diameter. Harding then took the tube out of Herbert's hands, and giving it a pendulous motion, he ended by lengthening the malleable bubble so as to give it a cylindro-conic shape. The blowing operation had given a cylinder of glass terminated by two hemispheric caps, which were easily detached by means of a sharp iron dipped in cold water. Then, by the same proceeding, this cylinder was cut lengthwise, and after having been rendered malleable by a second heating, it was extended on a plate and spread out with a wooden roller. The first pane was thus manufactured, and they had only to perform this operation 50 times to have 50 panes. The windows at Granite House were soon furnished with panes, not very white perhaps, but still sufficiently transparent. As to bottles and tumblers, that was only play. They were satisfied with them besides, just as they came from the end of the tube. Pencroft had asked to be allowed to blow in his turn, and it was great fun for him, but he blew so hard that his productions took the most ridiculous shapes, which he admired immensely. Cyrus Harding and Herbert, while hunting one day, had entered the forest of the Far West, on the left bank of the Mersey, and, as usual, the lad was asking 1,000 questions of the engineer, who answered them heartily. Now, as Harding was not a sportsman, and as on the other side Herbert was talking chemistry and natural philosophy, numbers of kangaroos, capybaras, and agoutis came within range, which, however, escaped the lad's gun. The consequence was that the day was already advanced, and the two hunters were in danger of having made a useless excursion, when Herbert, stopping, and uttering a cry of joy, exclaimed, "Oh, Captain Harding, do you see that tree?" And he pointed to a shrub rather than a tree, for it was composed of a single stem, covered with a scaly bark, which bore leaves streaked with little parallel veins. "And what is this tree which resembles a little palm?" asked Harding. "It is a Cycas revoluta, of which I have a picture in our Dictionary of Natural History," said Herbert. "But I can't see any fruit on this shrub," observed his companion. "No, Captain," replied Herbert, "but its stem contains a flower with which nature has provided us all ready ground." "It is, then, the bread tree?" "Yes, the bread tree." "Well, my boy," replied the engineer, "this is a valuable discovery. Since our wheat harvest is not yet ripe, I hope that you are not mistaken." Herbert was not mistaken. He broke the stem of a cycas, which was composed of a glandulous tissue, containing a quantity of floury pith, traversed with woody fiber, separated by rings of the same substance, arranged concentrically. With this fecula was mingled a mucilaginous juice of disagreeable flavor, but which it would be easy to get rid of by pressure. This cellular substance was regular flour of a superior quality, extremely nourishing. Its exportation was formerly forbidden by the Japanese laws. Cyrus Harding and Herbert, after having examined that part of the Far West where the cycas grew, took their bearings, and returned to Granite House, where they made known their discovery. The next day the settlers went to collect some, and returned to Granite House with an ample supply of cycas stems. The engineer constructed a press, with which to extract the mucilaginous juice mingled with the fecula, and he obtained a large quantity of flour, which Neb soon transformed into cakes and puddings. This was not quite real wheaten bread, but it was very like it. Now, too, the onager, the goats, and the sheep in the corral furnished daily the milk necessary to the colony. The cart, or rather a sort of light carriole which had replaced it, made frequent journeys to the corral, and when it was Pencroft's turn to go he took Jup, and let him drive, and Jup, cracking his whip, acquitted himself with his customary intelligence. Everything prospered, as well in the corral as in Granite House, and certainly the settlers, if it had not been that they were so far from their native land, had no reason to complain. They were so well suited to this life, and were, besides, so accustomed to the island, that they could not have left its hospitable soil without regret. And yet so deeply is the love of his country implanted in the heart of man, that if a ship had unexpectedly come in sight of the island, the colonists would have made signals, would have attracted her attention, and would have departed. It was the 1st of April, a Sunday, Easter Day, which Harding and his companions sanctified by rest and prayer. The day was fine, such as an October day in the northern hemisphere might be. All, towards the evening after dinner, were seated under the veranda on the edge of Prospect Heights, and they were watching the darkness creeping up from the horizon. Some cups of the infusion of elderberries, which took the place of coffee, had been served by Neb. They were speaking of the island and of its isolated situation in the Pacific, which led Gideon Spilett to say, "My dear Cyrus, have you ever, since you possess the sextant found in the case, again taken the position of our island?" "No," replied the engineer. "But it would perhaps be a good thing to do it with this instrument, which is more perfect than that which you before used." "What is the good?" said Pencroft. "The island is quite comfortable where it is." "Well, who knows?" returned the reporter. "Who knows but that we may be much nearer inhabited land than we think?" "We shall know tomorrow," replied Cyrus Harding. "And if it had not been for the occupations which left me no leisure, we should have known it already." "Good," said Pencroft. "The captain is too good an observer to be mistaken, and if it has not moved from its place, the island is just where he put it." "We shall see." On the next day, therefore, by means of the sextant, the engineer made the necessary observations to verify the position which he had already obtained, and this was the result of his operation. His first observation had given him the situation of Lincoln Island, in west longitude from 150 to 155 degrees, in south latitude from 30 to 35 degrees. The second gave exactly, in longitude, 150 degrees 30 minutes. In south latitude, 34 degrees 57 minutes. So then, notwithstanding the imperfection of his apparatus, Cyrus Harding had operated with so much skill that his error did not exceed 5 degrees. "Now," said Gideon Spilett, "since we possess an atlas as well as a sextant, let us see, my dear Cyrus, the exact position which Lincoln Island occupies in the Pacific." Herbert fetched the atlas, and the map of the Pacific was opened, and the engineer, compass in hand, prepared to determine their position. Suddenly the compasses stopped, and he exclaimed, "But an island exists in this part of the Pacific already." "An island?" cried Pencroft. "Tabor Island." "An important island?" "No, an islet lost in the Pacific, and which perhaps has never been visited." "Well, we will visit it," said Pencroft. "We?" "Yes, captain. We will build a decked boat, and I will undertake to steer her. At what distance are we from this Tabor Island?" "About 150 miles to the northeast," replied Harding. 150 miles! And what's that?" returned Pencroft. "In 48 hours, with a good wind, we should sight it." And, on this reply, it was decided that a vessel should be constructed in time to be launched towards the month of next October, on the return of the fine season. End of chapter. The Mysterious Island, by Jules Verne, Part 2, Chapter 10. When Pencroft had once got a plan in his head, he had no peace till it was executed. Now he wished to visit Tabor Island, and as a boat of a certain size was necessary for this voyage, he determined to build one. What wood should he employ? Elm or fir, both of which abounded in the island? They decided for the fir, as being easy to work, but that stands water as well as the elm. These details settled, it was agreed that since the fine season would not return before 6 months, Cyrus Harding and Pencroft should work alone at the boat. Gideon Spilett and Herbert were to continue to hunt, and neither Neb nor Master Jup, his assistant, were to leave the domestic duties which had devolved upon them. Directly the trees were chosen, they were felled, stripped of their branches, and sawn into planks as well as sawyers would have been able to do it. A week after, in the recess between the chimneys and the cliff, a dockyard was prepared, and a keel 35 feet long, furnished with a stern post at the stern and a stem at the bows, lay along the sand. Cyrus Harding was not working in the dark at this new trade. He knew as much about shipbuilding as about nearly everything else, and he had at first drawn the model of his ship on paper. Besides, he was ably seconded by Pencroft, who, having worked for several years in a dockyard in Brooklyn, knew the practical part of the trade. It was not until after careful calculation and deep thought that the timbers were laid on the keel. Pencroft, as may be believed, was all eagerness to carry out his new enterprise, and would not leave his work for an instant. A single thing had the honor of drawing him, but for one day only, from his dockyard. This was the second wheat harvest, which was gathered in on the 15th of April. It was as much a success as the first, and yielded the number of grains which had been predicted. 5 bushels, captain," said Pencroft, after having scrupulously measured his treasure. 5 bushels, replied the engineer, and 130,000 grains a bushel will make 650,000 grains. "Well, we will sow them all this time," said the sailor, "except a little in reserve." "Yes, Pencroft, and if the next crop gives a proportionate yield, we shall have 4,000 bushels." "And shall we eat bread?" "We shall eat bread." "But we must have a mill." "We will make one." The third cornfield was very much larger than the 2 first, and the soil, prepared with extreme care, received the precious seed. That done, Pencroft returned to his work. During this time Spilett and Herbert hunted in the neighborhood, and they ventured deep into the still unknown parts of the Far West, their guns loaded with ball, ready for any dangerous emergency. It was a vast thicket of magnificent trees, crowded together as if pressed for room. The exploration of these dense masses of wood was difficult in the extreme, and the reporter never ventured there without the pocket compass, for the sun scarcely pierced through the thick foliage, and it would have been very difficult for them to retrace their way. It naturally happened that game was more rare in those situations where there was hardly sufficient room to move. 2 or 3 large herbivorous animals were, however, killed during the last fortnight of April. These were koalas, specimens of which the settlers had already seen to the north of the lake, and which stupidly allowed themselves to be killed among the thick branches of the trees in which they took refuge. Their skins were brought back to Granite House, and there, by the help of sulphuric acid, they were subjected to a sort of tanning process which rendered them capable of being used. On the 30th of April, the 2 sportsmen were in the depth of the Far West, when the reporter, preceding Herbert a few paces, arrived in a sort of clearing, into which the trees more sparsely scattered had permitted a few rays to penetrate. Gideon Spilett was at first surprised at the odor which exhaled from certain plants with straight stalks, round and branchy, bearing grape-like clusters of flowers and very small berries. The reporter broke off 1 or 2 of these stalks and returned to the lad, to whom he said, "What can this be, Herbert?" "Well, Mr. Spilett," said Herbert, "this is a treasure which will secure you Pencroft's gratitude forever." "Is it tobacco?" "Yes, and though it may not be of the first quality, it is none the less tobacco." "Oh, good old Pencroft! Won't he be pleased? But we must not let him smoke it all. He must give us our share." "Ah, an idea occurs to me, Mr. Spilett," replied Herbert. "Don't let us say anything to Pencroft yet. We will prepare these leaves, and one fine day we will present him with a pipe already filled." "All right, Herbert, and on that day our worthy companion will have nothing left to wish for in this world." The reporter and the lad secured a good store of the precious plant, and then returned to Granite House, where they smuggled it in with as much precaution as if Pencroft had been the most vigilant and severe of custom-house officers. Cyrus Harding and Neb were taken into confidence, and the sailor suspected nothing during the whole time, necessarily somewhat long, which was required in order to dry the small leaves, chop them up, and subject them to a certain torrefaction on hot stones. This took 2 months, but all these manipulations were successfully carried on unknown to Pencroft, for, occupied with the construction of his boat, he only returned to Granite House at the hour of rest. For some days they had observed an enormous animal 2 or 3 miles out in the open sea, swimming around Lincoln Island. This was a whale of the largest size, which apparently belonged to the southern species called the Cape whale. "What a lucky chance it would be if we could capture it!" cried the sailor. "Ah, if we only had a proper boat and a good harpoon, I would say, 'After the beast!' for he would be well worth the trouble of catching." "Well, Pencroft," observed Harding, "I should much like to watch you handling a harpoon. It would be very interesting." "I am astonished," said the reporter, "to see a whale in this comparatively high latitude." "Why so, Mr. Spilett?" replied Herbert. "We are exactly in that part of the Pacific which English and American whalemen call the whale field, and it is here, between New Zealand and South America, that the whales of the southern hemisphere are met with in the greatest numbers." And Pencroft returned to his work, not without uttering a sigh of regret, for every sailor is a born fisherman, and if the pleasure of fishing is in exact proportion to the size of the animal, one can judge how a whaler feels in sight of a whale. And if this had only been for pleasure, but they could not help feeling how valuable such a prize would have been to the colony, for the oil, fat, and bones would have been put to many uses. Now it happened that this whale appeared to have no wish to leave the waters of the island. Therefore, whether from the windows of Granite House or from Prospect Heights, Herbert and Gideon Spilett, when they were not hunting, or Neb, unless presiding over his fires, never left the telescope, but watched all the animal's movements. The cetacean, having entered far into Union Bay, made rapid furrows across it from Mandible Cape to Claw Cape, propelled by its enormously powerful flukes, on which it supported itself, and making its way through the water at the rate little short of 12 knots an hour. Sometimes also it approached so near to the island that it could be clearly distinguished. It was the southern whale, which is completely black, the head being more depressed than that of the northern whale. They could also see it throwing up from its air holes to a great height a cloud of vapor, or of water, for, strange as it may appear, naturalists and whalers are not agreed on this subject. Is it air, or is it water which is thus driven out? It is generally admitted to be vapor, which, condensing suddenly by contact with the cold air, falls again as rain. However, the presence of this mammifer preoccupied the colonists. It irritated Pencroft especially, as he could think of nothing else while at work. He ended by longing for it, like a child for a thing which it has been denied. At night he talked about it in his sleep, and certainly if he had had the means of attacking it, if the sloop had been in a fit state to put to sea, he would not have hesitated to set out in pursuit. But what the colonists could not do for themselves, chance did for them, and on the 3rd of May shouts from Neb, who had stationed himself at the kitchen window, announced that the whale was stranded on the beach of the island. Herbert and Gideon Spilett, who were just about to set out hunting, left their guns. Pencroft threw down his axe, and Harding and Neb, joining their companions, all rushed towards the scene of action. The stranding had taken place on the beach of Flotsam Point, 3 miles from Granite House, and at high tide. It was therefore probable that the cetacean would not be able to extricate itself easily. At any rate, it was best to hasten, so as to cut off its retreat if necessary. They ran with pickaxes and iron-tipped poles in their hands, passed over the Mersey Bridge, descended the right bank of the river, along the beach, and in less than 20 minutes the settlers were close to the enormous animal, above which flocks of birds already hovered. "What a monster!" cried Neb. And the exclamation was natural, for it was a southern whale, 80 feet long, a giant of the species, probably not weighing less than 150,000 pounds. In the meanwhile, the monster thus stranded did not move, nor attempt by struggling to regain the water while the tide was still high. It was dead, and a harpoon was sticking out of its left side. "There are whalers in these quarters, then," said Gideon Spilett directly. "Oh, Mr. Spilett, that doesn't prove anything," replied Pencroft. "Whales have been known to go thousands of miles with a harpoon in the side, and this one might even have been struck in the north of the Atlantic and come to die in the south of the Pacific, and it would be nothing astonishing." Pencroft, having torn the harpoon from the animal's side, read this inscription on it: Maria Stella, Vineyard. "A vessel from the Vineyard! A ship from my country!" he cried. "The Maria Stella! A fine whaler, upon my word! I know her well! Oh, my friends, a vessel from the Vineyard! A whaler from the Vineyard!" And the sailor, brandishing the harpoon, repeated, not without emotion, the name which he loved so well, the name of his birthplace. But as it could not be expected that the Maria Stella would come to reclaim the animal harpooned by her, they resolved to begin cutting it up before decomposition should commence. The birds, who had watched this rich prey for several days, had determined to take possession of it without further delay, and it was necessary to drive them off by firing at them repeatedly. The whale was a female, and a large quantity of milk was taken from it, which, according to the opinion of the naturalist Duffenbach, might pass for cow's milk, and indeed it differs from it neither in taste, color, nor density. Pencroft had formerly served on board a whaling ship, and he could methodically direct the operation of cutting up, a sufficiently disagreeable operation lasting 3 days, but from which the settlers did not flinch, not even Gideon Spilett, who, as the sailor said, would end by making a real good castaway. The blubber, cut in parallel slices of 2 feet and a half in thickness, then divided into pieces which might weigh about 1,000 pounds each, was melted down in large earthen pots brought to the spot, for they did not wish to taint the environs of Granite House, and in this fusion it lost nearly a third of its weight. But there was an immense quantity of it. The tongue alone yielded 6,000 pounds of oil, and the lower lip 4,000. Then, besides the fat, which would ensure for a long time a store of stearine and glycerin, there were still the bones, for which a use could doubtless be found, although there was neither umbrellas nor stays used at Granite House. The upper part of the mouth of the cetacean was, indeed, provided on both sides with 800 horny blades, very elastic, of a fibrous texture, and fringed at the edge like great combs, at which the teeth, 6 feet long, served to retain the thousands of animalculae, little fish, and mollusks on which the whale fed. The operation finished, to the great satisfaction of the operators, the remains of the animal were left to the birds, who would soon make every vestige of it disappear, and their usual daily occupations were resumed by the inmates of Granite House. However, before returning to the dockyard, Cyrus Harding conceived the idea of fabricating certain machines, which greatly excited the curiosity of his companions. He took a dozen of the whale's bones, cut them into 6 equal parts, and sharpened their ends. This machine is not my own invention, and it is frequently employed by the Aleutian hunters in Russian America. You see these bones, my friends? Well, when it freezes, I will bend them, and then wet them with water till they are entirely covered with ice, which will keep them bent, and I will strew them on the snow, having previously covered them with fat. Now, what will happen if a hungry animal swallows one of these baits? Why, the heat of his stomach will melt the ice, and the bone, springing straight, will pierce him with its sharp points. "Well, I do call that ingenious," said Pencroft. "And it will spare the powder and shot," rejoined Cyrus Harding. "This will be better than traps," added Neb. In the meantime the boat building progressed, and towards the end of the month half the planking was completed. It could already be seen that her shape was excellent and that she would sail well. Pencroft worked with unparalleled ardor, and only a sturdy frame could have borne such fatigue, but his companions were preparing in secret a reward for his labors, and on the 31st of May he was to meet with one of the greatest joys of his life. On that day, after dinner, just as he was about to leave the table, Pencroft felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the hand of Gideon Spilett, who said, "One moment, Master Pencroft. You mustn't sneak off like that. You've forgotten your dessert." "Thank you, Mr. Spilett," replied the sailor. "I am going back to my work." "Well, a cup of coffee, my friend?" "Nothing more." "A pipe, then?" Pencroft jumped up, and his great good-natured face grew pale when he saw the reporter presenting him with a ready-filled pipe and Herbert with a glowing coal. The sailor endeavored to speak, but could not get out a word, so seizing the pipe he carried it to his lips, then applying the coal he drew 5 or 6 great whiffs. A fragrant blue cloud soon arose, and from its depths a voice was heard repeating excitedly, "Tobacco! Real tobacco!" "Yes, Pencroft," returned Cyrus Harding, "and very good tobacco, too." "Oh, divine Providence! Sacred author of all things!" cried the sailor. "Nothing more is now wanting to our island." And Pencroft smoked and smoked and smoked. "And who made this discovery?" he asked at length. "You, Herbert, no doubt?" "No, Pencroft, it was Mr. Spilett." "Mr. Spilett!" exclaimed the sailor, seizing the reporter, and clasping him to his breast with such a squeeze that he had never felt anything like it before. "Oh, Pencroft," said Spilett, recovering his breath at last, "a truce for one moment. You must share your gratitude with Herbert, who recognized the plant, with Cyrus, who prepared it, and with Neb, who took a great deal of trouble to keep our secret." "Well, my friends, I will repay you some day," replied the sailor. "Now we are friends for life." End of chapter. The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne, Part 2, Chapter 11. Winter arrived with the month of June, which is the December of the northern zones, and the great business was the making of warm and solid clothing. The musmons in the corral had been stripped of their wool, and this precious textile material was now to be transformed into stuff. Of course Cyrus Harding, having at his disposal neither carders, combers, polishers, stretchers, twisters, mule jenny, nor self-acting machine to spin the wool, nor loom to weave it, was obliged to proceed in a simpler way, so as to do without spinning and weaving. And indeed he proposed to make use of the property which the filaments of wool possess when subjected to a powerful pressure of mixing together, and of manufacturing by this simple process the material called felt. This felt could then be obtained by a simple operation which, if it diminished the flexibility of the stuff, increased its power of retaining heat in proportion. Now the wool furnished by the musmons was composed of very short hairs, and was in a good condition to be felted. The engineer, aided by his companions, including Pencroft, who was once more obliged to leave his boat, commenced the preliminary operations, the subject of which was to remove the wool of that fat and oily substance with which it is impregnated, and which is called grease. This cleaning was done in vats filled with water, which was maintained at the temperature of 70 degrees, and in which the wool was soaked for 24 hours. It was then thoroughly washed in baths of soda, and, when sufficiently dried by pressure, it was in a state to be compressed, that is to say, to produce a solid material, rough no doubt, and such as would have no value in a manufacturing center of Europe or America, but which would be highly esteemed in the Lincoln Island markets. This sort of material must have been known from the most ancient times, and in fact the first woolen stuffs were manufactured by the process which Harding was now about to employ. Where Harding's engineering qualifications now came into play was in the construction of the machine for pressing the wool, for he knew how to turn ingeniously to profit the mechanical force, hitherto unused, which the waterfall on the beach possessed to move a fulling mill. Nothing could be more rudimentary. The wool was placed in troughs, and upon it fell in turns heavy wooden mallets. Such was the machine in question, and such it had been for centuries until the time when the mallets were replaced by cylinders of compression, and the material was no longer subjected to beating, but to regular rolling. The operation, ably directed by Cyrus Harding, was a complete success. The wool, previously impregnated with a solution of soap, intended on the one hand to facilitate the interlacing, the compression, and the softening of the wool, and on the other to prevent its diminution by the beating, issued from the mill in the shape of thick felt cloth. The roughnesses with which the staple of wool is naturally filled were so thoroughly entangled and interlaced together that a material was formed equally suitable either for garments or bedclothes. It was certainly neither merino, muslin, cashmere, rep, satin, alpaca, cloth, nor flannel. It was Lincolnian felt, and Lincoln Island possessed yet another manufacture. The colonists had now warm garments and thick bedclothes, and they could without fear await the approach of the winter of 1866-67. The severe cold began to be felt about the 20th of June, and, to his great regret, Pencroft was obliged to suspend his boat building, which he hoped to finish in time for next spring. The sailor's great idea was to make a voyage of discovery to Tabor Island, although Harding could not approve of a voyage simply for curiosity's sake, for there was evidently nothing to be found on this desert and almost arid rock. A voyage of 150 miles in a comparatively small vessel, over unknown seas, could not but cause him some anxiety. Suppose that their vessel, once out at sea, should be unable to reach Tabor Island, and could not return to Lincoln Island, what would become of her in the midst of the Pacific, so fruitful of disasters? Harding often talked over this project with Pencroft, and he found him strangely bent upon undertaking this voyage, for which determination he himself could give no sufficient reason. "Now," said the engineer one day to him, "I must observe, my friend, that after having said so much in praise of Lincoln Island, after having spoken so often of the sorrow you would feel if you were obliged to forsake it, you are the first to wish to leave it." "Only to leave it for a few days," replied Pencroft. "Only for a few days, captain. Time to go and come back, and see what that island is like." "But it is not nearly as good as Lincoln Island." "I know that beforehand." "Then why venture there?" "To know what is going on in Tabor Island." "But nothing is going on there. Nothing could happen there." "Who knows?" "And if you are caught in a hurricane?" "There's no fear of that in the fine season," replied Pencroft. "But, captain, as we must provide against everything, I shall ask your permission to take Herbert only with me on this voyage." "Pencroft," replied the engineer, placing his hand on the sailor's shoulder, "if any misfortune happens to you, or to this lad, whom chance has made our child, do you think we could ever cease to blame ourselves?" "Captain Harding," replied Pencroft with unshaken confidence, "we shall not cause you that sorrow. Besides, we will speak further of this voyage when the time comes to make it. And I fancy, when you have seen our tight-rigged little craft, when you have observed how she behaves at sea, when we sail round our island, for we will do so together, I fancy, I say, that you will no longer hesitate to let me go. I don't conceal from you that your boat will be a masterpiece." "Say our boat, at least, Pencroft," replied the engineer, disarmed for the moment. The conversation ended thus, to be resumed later on, without convincing either the sailor or the engineer. The first snow fell towards the end of the month of June. The corral had previously been largely supplied with stores, so that daily visits to it were not requisite, but it was decided that more than a week should never be allowed to pass without someone going to it. Traps were again set, and the machines manufactured by Harding were tried. The bent whalebones, imprisoned in a case of ice and covered with a thick outer layer of fat, were placed on the border of the forest at a spot where animals usually passed on their way to the lake. To the engineer's great satisfaction, this invention, copied from the Aleutian fishermen, succeeded perfectly. A dozen foxes, a few wild boars, and even a jaguar were taken in this way, the animals being found dead, their stomachs pierced by the unbent bones. An incident here must be related, not only as interesting in itself, but because it was the first attempt made by the colonists to communicate with the rest of mankind. Gideon Spilett had already several times pondered whether to throw into the sea a letter enclosed in a bottle, which currents might perhaps carry to an inhabited coast, or to confide it to pigeons. But how could it be seriously hoped that either pigeons or bottles could cross the distance of 1,200 miles, which separated the island from any inhabited land? It would have been pure folly. But on the 30th of June the capture was effected, not without difficulty, of an albatross, which a shot from Herbert's gun had slightly wounded in the foot. It was a magnificent bird, measuring 10 feet from wing to wing, and which could traverse seas as wide as the Pacific. Herbert would have liked to keep this superb bird, as its wound would soon heal, and he thought he could tame it. But Spilett explained to him that he should not neglect this opportunity of attempting to communicate by this messenger with the lands of the Pacific, for if the albatross had come from some inhabited region, there was no doubt but that it would return there so soon as it was set free. Perhaps in his heart Gideon Spilett, in whom the journalist sometimes came to the surface, was not sorry to have the opportunity of sending forth to take its chance an exciting article relating the adventures of the settlers in Lincoln Island. What a success for the authorized reporter of the New York Herald, and for the number which should contain the article, if it should ever reach the address of its editor, the Honorable James Bennet. Gideon Spilett then wrote out a concise account, which was placed in a strong waterproof bag, with an earnest request to whoever might find it to forward it to the office of the New York Herald. This little bag was fastened to the neck of the albatross and not to its foot, for these birds are in the habit of resting on the surface of the sea. Then liberty was given to this swift courier of the air, and it was not without some emotion that the colonists watched it disappear in the misty west. "Where is he going to?" asked Pencroft. "Towards New Zealand," replied Herbert. "A good voyage to you!" shouted the sailor, who himself did not expect any great result from this mode of correspondence. With the winter, work had been resumed in the interior of Granite House, mending clothes and different occupations, among others making the sails for their vessel, which were cut from the inexhaustible balloon case. During the month of July the cold was intense, but there was no lack of either wood or coal. Cyrus Harding had established a second fireplace in the dining room, and there the long winter evenings were spent. Talking while they worked, reading when the hands remained idle, the time passed with profit to all. It was real enjoyment to the settlers when in their room, well lighted with candles, well warmed with coal, after a good dinner, elderberry coffee smoking in the cups, the pipes giving forth an odoriferous smoke, they could hear the storm howling without. Their comfort would have been complete, if complete comfort could ever exist for those who are far from their fellow creatures, and without any means of communication with them. They often talked of their country, of the friends whom they had left, of the grandeur of the American Republic, whose influence could not but increase. And Cyrus Harding, who had been much mixed up with the affairs of the Union, greatly interested his auditors by his recitals, his views, and his prognostics. It chanced one day that Spilett was led to say,
"But now, my dear Cyrus, all this industrial and commercial movement to which you predict a continual advance, does it not run the danger of being sooner or later completely stopped?"
"Stopped? And by what?"
"By the want of coal, which may justly be called the most precious of minerals."
"Yes, the most precious indeed," replied the engineer. "And it would seem that nature wished to prove that it was so by making the diamond, which is simply pure carbon crystallized." "You don't mean to say, Captain," interrupted Pencroft, "that we burn diamonds in our stoves in the shape of coal?"
"No, my friend," replied Harding. "However," resumed Gideon Spilett, "you do not deny that some day the coal will be entirely consumed?"
"Oh, the veins of coal are still considerable, and the 100,000 miners who annually extract from them 100 millions of hundredweights have not nearly exhausted them."
"With the continuing consumption of coal," replied Gideon Spilett, "it can be foreseen that the 100,000 workmen will soon become 200,000, and that the rate of extraction will be doubled."
"Doubtless, but after the European mines, which will be soon worked more thoroughly with new machines, the American and Australian mines will for a long time yet provide for the consumption in trade."
"For how long a time?" asked the reporter.
"For at least 250 or 300 years." "That is reassuring for us, but a bad lookout for our great-grandchildren," observed Pencroft. "They will discover something else," said Herbert.
"It is to be hoped so," answered Spilett, "for without coal there would be no machinery, and without machinery there would be no railways, no steamers, no manufactories, nothing of that which is indispensable to modern civilization."
"But what will they find?" asked Pencroft. "Can you guess, Captain?"
"Nearly, my friend."
"And what will they burn instead of coal?"
"Water," replied Harding.
"Water!" cried Pencroft. "Water as fuel for steamers and engines? Water to heat water?" "Yes, but water decomposed into its primitive elements," replied Cyrus Harding, "and decomposed doubtless by electricity, which will then have become a powerful and manageable force, for all great discoveries, by some inexplicable law, appear to agree and become complete at the same time. Yes, my friends, I believe that water will one day be employed as fuel, that hydrogen and oxygen which constitute it, used singly or together, will furnish an inexhaustible source of heat and light, of an intensity of which coal is not capable. Some day the coal rooms of steamers and the tenders of locomotives will, instead of coal, be stored with these two condensed gases, which will burn in the furnaces with enormous calorific power. There is therefore nothing to fear. As long as the earth is inhabited, it will supply the wants of its inhabitants, and there will be no want of either light or heat as long as the productions of the vegetable, mineral, or animal kingdoms do not fail us. I believe, then, that when the deposits of coal are exhausted, we shall heat and warm ourselves with water. Water will be the coal of the future."
"I should like to see that," observed the sailor.
"You were born too soon, Pencroft," returned Neb, who only took part in the discussion by these words. However, it was not Neb's speech which interrupted the conversation, but Top's barking, which broke out again with that strange intonation which had before perplexed the engineer. At the same time Top began to run round the mouth of the well, which opened at the extremity of the interior passage.
"What can Top be barking in that way for?" asked Pencroft.
"And Jup be growling like that," added Herbert. In fact, the orang, joining the dog, gave unequivocal signs of agitation, and, singular to say, the two animals appeared more uneasy than angry.
"It is evident," said Gideon Spilett, "that this well is in direct communication with the sea, and that some marine animal comes from time to time to breathe at the bottom." "That's evident," replied the sailor, "and there can be no other explanation to give. Quiet there, Top," added Pencroft, turning to the dog, "and you, Jup, be off to your room." The ape and the dog were silent. Jup went off to bed, but Top remained in the room, and continued to utter low growls at intervals during the rest of the evening. There was no further talk on the subject, but the incident, however, clouded the brow of the engineer. During the remainder of the month of July there was alternate rain and frost. The temperature was not so low as during the preceding winter, and its maximum did not exceed 8 degrees Fahrenheit. But although this winter was less cold, it was more troubled by storms and squalls. The sea, besides, often endangered the safety of the chimneys. At times it almost seemed as if an undercurrent raised these monstrous billows which thundered against the wall of Granite House. When the settlers, leaning from their windows, gazed on the huge watery masses breaking beneath their eyes, they could not but admire the magnificent spectacle of the ocean in its impotent fury. The waves rebounded in dazzling foam, the beach entirely disappearing under the raging flood, and the cliff appearing to emerge from the sea itself, the spray rising to a height of more than 100 feet. During these storms it was difficult and even dangerous to venture out, owing to the frequently falling trees. However, the colonists never allowed a week to pass without having paid a visit to the corral. Happily, this enclosure, sheltered by the southeastern spur of Mount Franklin, did not greatly suffer from the violence of the hurricanes, which spared its trees, sheds, and palisades. But the poultry yard on Prospect Heights, being directly exposed to the gusts of wind from the east, suffered considerable damage. The pigeon house was twice unroofed and the paling blown down. All this required to be remade more solidly than before, for, as may be clearly seen, Lincoln Island was situated in one of the most dangerous parts of the Pacific. It really appeared as if it formed the central point of vast cyclones, which beat it perpetually as the whip does the top. Only here it was the top which was motionless and the whip which moved. During the first week of the month of August, the weather became more moderate, and the atmosphere recovered the calm which it appeared to have lost forever. With the calm, the cold again became intense, and the thermometer fell to 8 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. On the 3rd of August, an excursion which had been talked of for several days was made into the southeastern part of the island, towards Tadorn Marsh. The hunters were tempted by the aquatic game which took up their winter quarters there. Wild duck, snipe, teal, and grebe abounded there, and it was agreed that a day should be devoted to an expedition against these birds. Not only Gideon Spilett and Herbert, but Pencroft and Neb also took part in this excursion. Cyrus Harding alone, alleging some work as an excuse, did not join them, but remained at Granite House. The hunters proceeded in the direction of Port Balloon in order to reach the marsh, after having promised to be back by the evening. Top and Jup accompanied them. As soon as they had passed over the Mercy Bridge, the engineer raised it and returned, intending to put into execution a project for the performance of which he wished to be alone. Now this project was to minutely explore the interior well, the mouth of which was on a level with the passage of Granite House, and which communicated with the sea, since it formerly supplied a way to the waters of the lake. Why did Top so often run around this opening? Why did he utter such strange barks when a sort of uneasiness seemed to draw him towards this well? Why did Jup join Top in a sort of common anxiety? Had this well branches besides the communication with the sea? Did it spread towards other parts of the island? This is what Cyrus Harding wished to know. He had resolved, therefore, to attempt the exploration of the well during the absence of his companions, and an opportunity for doing so had now presented itself. It was easy to descend to the bottom of the well by employing the rope ladder, which had not been used since the establishment of the lift. The engineer drew the ladder to the hole, the diameter of which measured nearly 6 feet,
and allowed it to unroll itself after having securely fastened its upper extremity. Then, having lighted a lantern, taken a revolver, and placed a cutlass in his belt, he began the descent. The sides were everywhere entire, but points of rock jutted out here and there, and by means of these points it would have been quite possible for an active creature to climb to the mouth of the well. The engineer remarked this, but although he carefully examined these points by the light of his lantern, he could find no impression, no fracture which could give any reason to suppose that they had either recently or at any former time been used as a staircase. Cyrus Harding descended deeper, throwing the light of his lantern on all sides. He saw nothing suspicious. When the engineer had reached the last rounds he came upon the water, which was then perfectly calm. Neither at its level nor in any other part of the well did any passage open which could lead to the interior of the cliff. The wall which Harding struck with the hilt of his cutlass sounded solid. It was compact granite, through which no living being could force a way. To arrive at the bottom of the well and then climb up to its mouth, it was necessary to pass through the channel under the rocky subsoil of the beach, which placed it in communication with the sea, and this was only possible for marine animals. As to the question of knowing where this channel ended, at what point of the shore, and at what depth beneath the water, it could not be answered. Then Cyrus Harding, having ended his survey, reascended, drew up the ladder, covered the mouth of the well, and returned thoughtfully to the dining-room, saying to himself, "I have seen nothing, and yet there is something there." End of chapter. The Mysterious Island, by Jules Verne, Part 2, Chapter 12. In the evening the hunters returned, having enjoyed good sport, and being literally loaded with game. Indeed, they had as much as 4 men could possibly carry. Top wore a necklace of teal, and Jup wreaths of snipe round his body. "Here, master," cried Neb, "here's something to employ our time. Preserved and made into pies, we shall have a welcome store. But I must have someone to help me. I count on you, Pencroft." "No, Neb," replied the sailor. "I have the rigging of the vessel to finish and to look after, and you will have to do without me." "And you, Mr. Herbert?" "I must go to the corral tomorrow, Neb," replied the lad. "It will be you, then, Mr. Spilett, who will help me?" "To oblige you, Neb, I will," replied the reporter. "But I warn you that if you disclose your recipes to me, I shall publish them." "Whenever you like, Mr. Spilett," replied Neb. "Whenever you like." And so the next day Gideon Spilett became Neb's assistant, and was installed in his culinary laboratory. The engineer had previously made known to him the result of the exploration which he had made the day before, and on this point the reporter shared Harding's opinion, that although he had found nothing, a secret still remained to be discovered. The frost continued for another week, and the settlers did not leave Granite House unless to look after the poultry yard. The dwelling was filled with appetizing odors, which were emitted from the learned manipulation of Neb and the reporter. But all the results of the chase were not made into preserved provisions, and as the game kept perfectly in the intense cold, wild duck and other fowl were eaten fresh, and declared superior to all other aquatic birds in the known world. During this week, Pencroft, aided by Herbert, who handled the sailmaker's needle with much skill, worked with such energy that the sails of the vessel were finished. There was no want of cordage. Thanks to the rigging which had been discovered with the case of the balloon, the ropes and cables from the net were all of good quality, and the sailor turned them all to account. To the sails were attached strong bolt ropes, and there still remained enough from which to make the halyards, shrouds, and sheets, etc. The blocks were manufactured by Cyrus Harding under Pencroft's directions by means of the turning lathe. It therefore happened that the rigging was entirely prepared before the vessel was finished. Pencroft also manufactured a flag, that flag so dear to every true American, containing the stars and stripes of their glorious Union. The colors for it were supplied from certain plants used in dyeing, and which were very abundant in the island. Only to the 37 stars, representing the 37 states of the Union, which shine on the American flag, the sailor added a 38th, the star of the state of Lincoln, for he considered his island as already united to the great republic. "And," said he, "it is so already in heart, if not in deed." In the meantime, the flag was hoisted at the central window of Granite House, and the settlers saluted it with 3 cheers. The cold season was now almost at an end, and it appeared as if this second winter was to pass without any unusual occurrence, when on the night of the 11th of August the plateau of Prospect Heights was menaced with complete destruction. After a busy day the colonists were sleeping soundly, when towards 4 o'clock in the morning they were suddenly awakened by Top's barking. The dog was not this time barking near the mouth of the well, but at the threshold of the door, at which he was scratching as if he wished to burst it open. Jup was also uttering piercing cries. "Hello, Top!" cried Neb, who was the first awake. But the dog continued to bark more furiously than ever. "What's the matter now?" asked Harding. And all, dressing in haste, rushed to the windows, which they opened. Beneath their eyes was spread a sheet of snow which looked gray in the dim light. The settlers could see nothing, but they heard a singular yelping noise away in the darkness. It was evident that the beach had been invaded by a number of animals which could not be seen. "What are they?" cried Pencroft. "Wolves, jaguars, or apes?" replied Neb. "They have nearly reached the plateau," said the reporter. "And our poultry yard!" exclaimed Herbert. "And our garden!" "Where can they have crossed?" asked Pencroft. "They must have crossed the bridge on the shore," replied the engineer, "which one of us must have forgotten to close." "True," said Spilett. "I remember having left it open." "A fine job you've made of it, Mr. Spilett!" cried the sailor. "What is done cannot be undone," replied Cyrus Harding. "We must consult what it will now be best to do." Such were the questions and answers which were rapidly exchanged between Harding and his companions. It was certain that the bridge had been crossed, that the shore had been invaded by animals, and that whatever they might be, they could by ascending the left bank of the Mercy reach Prospect Heights. They must therefore be advanced against quickly and fought with, if necessary. "But what are these beasts?" was asked a second time, as the yelpings were again heard more loudly than before. These yelps made Herbert start, and he remembered having heard them before during his first visit to the sources of the Red Creek. "They are colpios! Foxes!" he exclaimed. "Forward!" shouted the sailor. And all arming themselves with hatchets, carbines, and revolvers, threw themselves into the lift and soon set foot on the shore. Colpios are dangerous animals when in great numbers and irritated by hunger. Nevertheless, the colonists did not hesitate to throw themselves into the midst of the troop, and their first shots, vividly lighting up the darkness, made their assailants draw back. The chief thing was to hinder these plunderers from reaching the plateau, for the garden and the poultry yard would then have been at their mercy. An immense, perhaps irreparable mischief would inevitably be the result, especially with regard to the cornfield. But as the invasion of the plateau could only be made by the left bank of the Mercy, it was sufficient to oppose the colpios on the narrow bank between the river and the cliff of granite. This was plain to all, and by Cyrus Harding's orders they reached the spot indicated by him, while the colpios rushed fiercely through the gloom. Harding, Gideon Spilett, Herbert, Pencroft, and Neb posted themselves in impregnable line. Top, his formidable jaws open, preceded the colonists, and he was followed by Jup, armed with knotty cudgel, which he brandished like a club. The night was extremely dark. It was only by the flashes from the revolvers as each person fired that they could see their assailants, who were at least 100 in number, and whose eyes were glowing like hot coals. "They must not pass!" shouted Pencroft.
"They shall not pass," returned the engineer.
But if they did not pass, it was not for want of having attempted it. Those in the rear pushed on the foremost assailants, and it was an incessant struggle with revolvers and hatchets. Several Colpios already lay dead on the ground, but their number did not appear to diminish, and it might have been supposed that reinforcements were continually arriving over the bridge. The colonists were soon obliged to fight at close quarters, not without receiving some wounds, although happily very slight ones. Herbert had, with a shot from his revolver, rescued Neb, on whose back a Colpio had sprung like a tiger cat. Top fought with actual fury, flying at the throats of the foxes and strangling them instantaneously. Jup wielded his weapon valiantly, and it was in vain that they endeavored to keep him in the rear. Endowed doubtless with sight which enabled him to pierce the obscurity, he was always in the thick of the fight, uttering from time to time a sharp hissing sound, which was with him the sign of great rejoicing. At one moment he advanced so far that by the light from a revolver he was seen surrounded by 5 or 6 large Colpios, with whom he was coping with great coolness. However, the struggle was ended at last, and victory was on the side of the settlers, but not until they had fought for 2 long hours. The first signs of the approach of day doubtless determined the retreat of their assailants, who scampered away towards the north, passing over the bridge, which Neb ran immediately to raise. When day had sufficiently lighted up the field of battle, the settlers counted as many as 50 dead bodies scattered about on the shore. "And Jup!" cried Pencroft. "Where is Jup?" Jup had disappeared. His friend Neb called him, and for the first time Jup did not reply to his friend's call. Everyone set out in search of Jup, trembling lest he should be found among the slain. They cleared the place of the bodies which stained the snow with their blood. Jup was found in the midst of a heap of Colpios whose broken jaws and crushed bodies showed that they had to do with the terrible club of the intrepid animal. Poor Jup still held in his hand the stump of his broken cudgel, but deprived of his weapon he had been overpowered by numbers, and his chest was covered with severe wounds. "He is living!" cried Neb, who was bending over him. "And we will save him," replied the sailor. "We will nurse him as if he was one of ourselves." It appeared as if Jup understood, for he leaned his head on Pencroft's shoulder as if to thank him. The sailor was wounded himself, but his wound was insignificant, as were those of his companions, for thanks to their firearms they had been almost always able to keep their assailants at a distance. It was therefore only the orang whose condition was serious. Jup, carried by Neb and Pencroft, was placed in the lift, and only a slight moan now and then escaped his lips. He was gently drawn up to Granite House. There he was laid on a mattress taken from one of the beds, and his wounds were bathed with the greatest care. It did not appear that any vital part had been reached, but Jup was very weak from loss of blood, and a high fever soon set in after his wounds had been dressed. He was laid down. Strict diet was imposed, "just like a real person," as Neb said, and they made him swallow several cups of a cooling drink, for which the ingredients were supplied from the vegetable medicine chest of Granite House. Jup was at first restless, but his breathing gradually became more regular, and he was left sleeping quietly. From time to time Top, walking on tiptoe, as one might say, came to visit his friend, and seemed to approve of all the care that had been taken of him. One of Jup's hands hung over the side of his bed, and Top licked it with a sympathizing air. They employed the day in interring the dead, who were dragged to the forest of the far west, and there buried deep. This attack, which might have had such serious consequences, was a lesson to the settlers, who from this time never went to bed until one of their number had made sure that all the bridges were raised, and that no invasion was possible. However, Jup, after having given them serious anxiety for several days, began to recover. His constitution brought him through, the fever gradually subsided, and Gideon Spilett, who was a bit of a doctor, pronounced him quite out of danger. On the 16th of August Jupe began to eat. Neb made him nice little sweet dishes, which the invalid devoured with great relish, for if he had a pet failing it was that of being somewhat of a gourmand, and Neb had never done anything to cure him of this fault. "What would you have?" said he to Gideon Spilett, who sometimes expostulated with him for spoiling the ape. "Poor Jupe has no other pleasure than that of the palate, and I am only too glad to be able to reward his services in this way." 10 days after having taken to his bed, on the 21st of August, Master Jupe arose. His wounds were healed, and it was evident that he would not be long in regaining his usual strength and agility. Like all convalescents, he was tremendously hungry, and the reporter allowed him to eat as much as he liked, for he trusted to that instinct, which is too often wanting in reasoning beings, to keep the orang from any excess. Neb was delighted to see his pupil's appetite returning. "Eat away, my Jupe," said he, "and don't spare anything. You have shed your blood for us, and it is the least I can do to make you strong again." On the 25th of August Neb's voice was heard calling to his companions, "Captain, Mr. Spilett, Mr. Herbert, Pencroft, come, come!" The colonists, who were together in the dining-room, rose at Neb's call, who was then in Jupe's room. "What's the matter?" asked the reporter. "Look!" replied Neb, with a shout of laughter. And what did they see? Master Jupe smoking calmly and seriously, sitting cross-legged like a Turk at the entrance to Granite House. "My pipe!" cried Pencroft. "He has taken my pipe! Hello, my honest Jupe! I make you a present of it. Smoke away, old boy, smoke away!" And Jupe gravely puffed out clouds of smoke, which seemed to give him great satisfaction. Harding did not appear to be much astonished at this incident, and he cited several examples of tame apes, to whom the use of tobacco had become quite familiar. But from this day Master Jupe had a pipe of his own, the sailor's ex-pipe, which was hung in his room near his store of tobacco. He filled it himself, lighted it with a glowing coal, and appeared to be the happiest of quadrumana. It may readily be understood that this similarity of tastes of Jupe and Pencroft served to tighten the bonds of friendship which already existed between the honest ape and the worthy sailor. "Perhaps he's really a man," said Pencroft sometimes to Neb. "Should you be surprised to hear him beginning to speak to us some day?" "My word, no," replied Neb. "What astonishes me is that he hasn't spoken to us before, for now he wants nothing but speech." "It would amuse me all the same," resumed the sailor, "if some fine day he said to me, 'Suppose we change pipes, Pencroft?'" "Yes," replied Neb. "What a pity he was born dumb!" With the month of September the winter ended, and the works were again eagerly commenced. The building of the vessel advanced rapidly. She was already completely decked over, and all the inside parts of the hull were firmly united with ribs bent by means of steam, which answered all the purposes of a mold. As there was no want of wood, Pencroft proposed to the engineer to give a double lining to the hull, to ensure the strength of the vessel. Harding, not knowing what the future might have in store for them, approved the sailor's idea of making the craft as strong as possible. The interior and deck of the vessel was entirely finished towards the 15th of September. For caulking the seams they made oakum of dry seaweed, which was hammered in between the planks. Then these seams were covered with boiling tar, which was obtained in great abundance from the pines in the forest. The management of the vessel was very simple. She had from the first been ballasted with heavy blocks of granite walled up in a bed of lime, 12,000 pounds of which they stowed away. A deck was placed over this ballast, and the interior was divided into 2 cabins, 2 benches extended along them, and served also as lockers. The foot of the mast supported the partition which separated the 2 cabins. which were reached by two hatchways let into the deck. Pencroft had no trouble in finding a tree suitable for the mast. He chose a straight young fir, with no knots, and which he had only to square at the step and round off at the top. The ironwork of the mast, the rudder, and the hull had been roughly but strongly forged at the chimneys. Lastly, yards, masts, boom, spars, oars, etc., were all finished by the first week in October, and it was agreed that a trial trip should be taken round the island, so as to ascertain how the vessel would behave at sea, and how far they might depend upon her. During all this time the necessary works had not been neglected. The corral was enlarged, for the flock of musmons and goats had been increased by a number of young ones, who had to be housed and fed. The colonists had paid visits also to the oyster bed, the warren, the coal and iron mines, and to the till then unexplored districts of the far west forest, which abounded in game. Certain indigenous plants were discovered, and those fit for immediate use contributed to vary the vegetable stores of Granite House. They were a species of ficoid, some similar to those of the Cape, with eatable fleshy leaves, others bearing seeds containing a sort of flower. On the 10th of October the vessel was launched. Pencroft was radiant with joy. The operation was perfectly successful. The boat, completely rigged, having been pushed on rollers to the water's edge, was floated by the rising tide amid the cheers of the colonists, particularly of Pencroft, who showed no modesty on this occasion. Besides, his importance was to last beyond the finishing of the vessel, since, after having built her, he was to command her. The grade of captain was bestowed upon him with the approbation of all. To satisfy Captain Pencroft, it was now necessary to give a name to the vessel, and after many propositions had been discussed, the votes were all in favor of the Bonadventure. As soon as the Bonadventure had been lifted by the rising tide, it was seen that she lay evenly in the water and would be easily navigated. However, the trial trip was to be made that very day, by an excursion off the coast. The weather was fine, the breeze fresh, and the sea smooth, especially towards the south coast, for the wind was blowing from the northwest. "All hands on board!" shouted Pencroft, but breakfast was first necessary, and it was thought best to take provisions on board, in the event of their excursion being prolonged until the evening. Cyrus Harding was equally anxious to try the vessel, the model of which had originated with him, although on the sailor's advice he had altered some parts of it, but he did not share Pencroft's confidence in her, and as the latter had not again spoken of the voyage to Tabor Island, Harding hoped he had given it up. He would have indeed great reluctance in letting 2 or 3 of his companions venture so far in so small a boat, which was not of more than 15 tons burden. At 10:30 everybody was on board, even Top and Jup, and Herbert weighed the anchor, which was fast in the sand near the mouth of the Mercy. The sail was hoisted, the Lincolnian flag floated from the masthead, and the Bonadventure, steered by Pencroft, stood out to sea. The wind blowing out of Union Bay, she ran before it, and thus showed her owners, much to their satisfaction, that she possessed a remarkably fast pair of heels, according to Pencroft's mode of speaking. After having doubled Flotsam Point and Claw Cape, the captain kept her close hauled, so as to sail along the southern coast of the island, when it was found she sailed admirably within 5 points of the wind. All hands were enchanted. They had a good vessel, which, in case of need, would be of great service to them, and with fine weather and a fresh breeze, the voyage promised to be charming. Pencroft now stood off the shore, 3 or 4 miles across from Port Balloon. The island then appeared in all its extent and under a new aspect, with the varied panorama of its shore from Claw Cape to Reptile End, the forests in which dark firs contrasted with the young foliage of other trees and overlooked the whole, and Mount Franklin, whose lofty head was still whitened with snow. "How beautiful it is!" cried Herbert.
"Yes, our island is beautiful and good," replied Pencroft. "I love it as I love my poor mother. It received us poor and destitute, and now what is wanting for us 5 fellows who fell on it from the sky?" "Nothing," replied Neb. "Nothing, captain." And the 2 brave men gave 3 tremendous cheers in honor of their island. During all this time, Gideon Spilett, leaning against the mast, sketched the panorama which was developed before his eyes. Cyrus Harding gazed on it in silence. "Well, Captain Harding," asked Pencroft, "what do you think of our vessel?" "She appears to behave well," replied the engineer. "Good! And do you think now that she could undertake a voyage of some extent?" "What voyage, Pencroft?" "One to Tabor Island, for instance." "My friend," replied Harding, "I think that in any pressing emergency we need not hesitate to trust ourselves to the Bonadventure even for a longer voyage. But you know I should see you set off to Tabor Island with great uneasiness, since nothing obliges you to go there." "One likes to know one's neighbors," returned the sailor, who was obstinate in his idea. "Tabor Island is our neighbor, and the only one. Politeness requires us to go at least to pay a visit." "By Jove," said Spilett, "our friend Pencroft has become very particular about the proprieties all at once." "I am not particular about anything at all," retorted the sailor, who was rather vexed by the engineer's opposition, but who did not wish to cause him anxiety. "Consider, Pencroft," resumed Harding, "you cannot go alone to Tabor Island." "One companion will be enough for me." "Even so," replied the engineer, "you will risk depriving the colony of Lincoln Island of 2 settlers out of 5. "Out of 6," replied Pencroft. "You forget Jupe." "Out of 7," added Neb. "Top is quite worth another." "There is no risk at all in it, captain," replied Pencroft. "That is possible, Pencroft, but I repeat it is to expose ourselves uselessly." The obstinate sailor did not reply, and let the conversation drop, quite determined to resume it again. But he did not suspect that an incident would come to his aid and change into an act of humanity that which was at first only a doubtful whim. After standing off the shore, the Bonadventure again approached it in the direction of Port Balloon. It was important to ascertain the channels between the sandbanks and reefs, that buoys might be laid down, since this little creek was to be the harbor. They were not more than half a mile from the coast, and it was necessary to tack to beat against the wind. The Bonadventure was then going at a very moderate rate, as the breeze, partly intercepted by the high land, scarcely swelled her sails, and the sea, smooth as glass, was only rippled now and then by passing gusts. Herbert had stationed himself in the bows that he might indicate the course to be followed among the channels, when all at once he shouted, "Luff, Pencroft, luff!" "What's the matter?" replied the sailor. "A rock?" "No. Wait," said Herbert. "I don't quite see. Luff again. Right now." So saying, Herbert, leaning over the side, plunged his arm into the water and pulled it out, exclaiming, "A bottle!" He held in his hand a corked bottle which he had just seized a few cables' length from the shore. Cyrus Harding took the bottle. Without uttering a single word, he drew the cork, and took from it a damp paper, on which were written these words: "Castaway, Tabor Island, 153 degrees west longitude, 37 degrees 11 minutes south latitude." End of chapter.